Good evening, everyone, and glad you're here for another evening. We pick up again on the third theme of our series on living with Imperial Legacies, and we'll try and explore a little bit tonight as to how Europe rules the world or ruled the world, and some of the modern imperial domination that has been the experience of large parts of our planet. Now, empires we have always had with us, it seems, at least from quite a long way back, as soon as humankind organized itself into a much more settled life, developed city-states and then standing armies, rule over others, control, domination, economic extraction, and some form of divinity and some authoritarian shape or form, that became part of imperial experience. For others, they were colonized, they resisted, and eventually empire collapsed, often to be replaced by another. But it does seem that empires are a constant of human history, with origins in some of the earliest historical epochs. The pyramids of Egypt were constructed for empire builders. So too were the Roman roads and aqueducts and the Indian railways, and the great palaces found in every continent. But empire, though we're looking tonight at a European story, it's not just a European story. The Han Chinese created an empire in East Asia. It had its day. It was succeeded by the Mongols, who were followed by the Manchurians. There were successive empires in Southeast Asia, the Japanese Empire. And straddling East and West in some sense was the Ottoman Empire, a tricontinental empire, taking in parts of Asia, Europe, and Africa. And of course, the Aztecs and Incas in South America were imperial powers crushed and eliminated by the European imperial powers. And in the modern European era, empires appear, and by the early 20th century, the European empires are ruling some 85% of the planet. So empires we have always had, it seems, but from the 15th to the 20th centuries, Europe ruled the world. European empires have, of course, all collapsed in the 20th century. They have become part of the wreckage of history, as all empires do. But the legacies live on, and they are at the heart of many of the world's seemingly intractable problems. European hegemony now, we can say, I think, is greatly diminished. But the important narratives are not those written and told by the powers themselves, but by those from below, those who have experienced the domination, colonization, and exploitation. These are the histories which are now increasingly being written. But from that 15th to 19th century, Europe did rule the world through different European empires. They carved up the world between them. They extracted huge wealth and introduced slavery at the heart of their capitalistic systems. Indeed, empires were built on slavery. And the industrial revolutions developed on the backs of slaves, not just those in the plantations of the Americas, but on the white slaves who kept the cotton mills going, that built the railways and made the few owners extraordinarily rich. And populations colluded with their imperial domination in the world and benefited from it, took pride in its greatness, and young men were ready to sacrifice their lives for God and fatherland, or God and empire. The empire itself promising them some kind of eternal life and glorious immortality if they did so. And empires, it seems, had power over life and death, not only controlling the lives of the colonized and the enslaved, but the lives of their subjects at home. And even empires controlling, it would seem, the affairs of God. Because empires were ultimate, absolutist. They would last, it was believed, forever. Hitler was not the only imperialist in Europe who dreamt of a 1,000-year Reich or kingdom. Every modern European empire did. But imperial hubris overtook them. and in a relatively short time their imperial rule came to an end. There was always resistance from the colonized, and there were always critics at home, voices raised in dissent, raising critical questions about the dubious wealth of imperialism, their behavior abroad, anti-colonial campaigns, anti-slavery movement, the opposition at the beginning of the 20th century to the horrific and brutal murders and exactions of the local population in the Congo. And this brings us to an Irish person, Roger Casement, an Irish Protestant educated in a Ballymena diocesan school. Saw colonialism in its most brutal form in the Congo. In 1904, Casement produced a major report for the British government, indicting the horrific system of oppression and cruelty in the Congo by Belgium's King Leopold. The Foreign Office watered down Casement's report. Does this begin to sound familiar? Redacted is a word we've heard in the last couple of days. The Foreign Office redacted Casement's report, but by 1908 the Belgian government had decided to take over the administration of the Congo. But Casement was knighted by the British and he continued to expose colonial abuses. And in 1910, Sir Roger Casement was part of a commission of inquiry to look at the exploitation and abuse of local Amerindians in the Amazon. Now, Casement's report was widely praised, but in the end, the Amerindians were only liberated from exploitation by the collapse of the rubber market. But after 30 years in the service of empire in Britain, Africa, and South America, Casement turned his attention to his native Ireland and immersed himself in the Irish nationalist cause, trying to win over Ulster Protestants to Irish nationalism. Casement was part of the Protestant group who organised and carried out the gun running in Howth in 1914. Captured by British forces on a Kerry strand in 1916, Casement, who had been knighted for his role in exposing colonial brutality in the Congo, and later Portuguese imperial brutality in the Amazon, Casement was then stripped of his knighthood, tried for treason, and was hanged on the 3rd of August 1916. Michael Laffan, the historian, has said that he was a humanitarian who fought with bravery and determination against the enslavement of indigenous peoples in the Congo and Amazonia. So Casement had exposed the worst brutal excesses of colonialism and empire, had thrown himself into the liberation of his own country from one of those empires. And in the end, he was executed by that empire that had commissioned him to expose imperial brutality and exploitation, and knighted him for his services. While perhaps all forms of imperialism are riddled with inconsistencies, contradictions, and the seeds of their own destruction, and no European imperial power has survived. There were a number of them, 7 European powers from the years from the 15th to the 19th or 20th centuries. We can't look at all of them, but we want to look at the first one in this first part of the evening and quickly look at the Portuguese Empire. Now, if you have been in the city of Lisbon, along the waterfront in Lisbon, there is a huge sculpture looking out to the sea. It's a late 20th century construction. And all the famous Portuguese explorers are there, looking, gazing way beyond the horizon. And gathered closely around them are the missionaries with prayer beads and sacred texts. And here is Portugal's imperial past of discovery and conquest, with a very visual reminder that the voyages of exploration and discovery and the building of empire was political, commercial, and religious. Europe's empires expanded, we remember, from Christendom states. And the expansion of empire was also about the expansion of the church. And the explorers and empire builders were blessed by the church, and God and empire were inseparable. The beginnings of the Portuguese Empire were African, and then their trading empire reached out into the Indian Ocean. On the 22nd of November 1497, after being at sea for 5 months, Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope and sailed for the Indian Ocean. Mozambique was reached in February 1498. By May, he had reached India, and he mistook Hindu temples for churches. Da Gama actually prayed to a Hindu goddess, thinking she was the Virgin Mary. And then he and his crew members were startled by the sophistication they found in the local societies. Now, naval power was key to Portuguese expansion, and so better ships were built. And by 1505, the Portuguese had created the state of India, and between 1507 and 1511, commercial factories were set up in Mozambique, Goa, Malacca, and Ormuz. And soon the Portuguese were in touch with China and began to control trade. And as that huge monument in Lisbon Harbour suggests, this commercial and imperial expansion went hand in hand with intense missionary activity. By the 1630s, there were 1,800 missionaries in Portuguese Asia, representing the main religious orders, especially Jesuits. Now, Portugal wasn't to have its own way, all its own way. The Dutch were in the area and were beginning to take some of Portugal's possessions or territories. But then in 1500, a Portuguese fleet bound for India ended up on the opposite side of the Atlantic, ended up in Brazil. Portugal had discovered a lucrative Brazilian sugar economy. And quickly, Portuguese people were to travel and settled in Brazil, some 50,000 in the 1500s, including many women, were in Brazil. And the sugar industry expanded, but disease also claimed many lives. The answer, though, to the workforce problem was found in West Africa. And after the 1550s, Portugal had transported 50,000 African slaves to Brazil. Brazilian gold was discovered and flowed into Portugal, and leading the Portuguese king to describe Brazil as his milch cow. Slaves learned to speak Portuguese and adopted Catholicism. France created problems for Portugal, and after a revolt, Portugal turned its attention elsewhere, returned to Africa in expansionist mode after 1822, and the presence in Angola was strengthened, but slavery was still the major issue. In 1820, Portugal was the only European power not to abolish slavery. Britain threatened to repartition the Portuguese colonies. So in Africa, things changed radically for Portugal. They changed radically between 1930 and 1961. Nationalist and liberation movements were strong in Angola and Mozambique. Portugal faced open revolt in 3 of its African territories. But because so many white Portuguese had settled in Angola and Mozambique, that's what empires do. The citizens of empires settle in the countries that are dominated and under conquest. Because so many white Portuguese had settled in Angola and Mozambique, Portugal was able to resist the growing African nationalism for more than a decade. But the tide could not be resisted forever. And the big revolt came in 1974. Portugal formally granted independence in 1975. That is in the lifetime of most of us, I suppose. But Portugal was the first European country to acquire an overseas empire, and it was the last to renounce it. Over 5 centuries, several million left Portugal for Asia, Brazil, and Africa. And like all empires, Portugal used brutal violence and was central to the slave trade that displaced millions of Africans. It left Portuguese identity and language in its former colonies, and the imperial missionary activity left a religious stamp, Catholic Christianity. Many Angolans are to be found today in Lisbon. And many of Brazil's most famous footballers are the descendants of Black African slaves. And Portugal's most famous soccer player, not necessarily Ronaldo, but Eusebio, was in fact a Black genius from Mozambique. Well, that's something of the empires. Let's go into the European one, the first European one, and the role of casement. Let's, Loretto, move into rooms and we can have a conversation around some of that. There are a couple of questions that will be posted. Well, what did you make of Casement's execution for treason, given that he had exposed the brutality of 2 imperial powers, Belgium and Portugal? And that Portuguese empire had a sell-by date, lasted quite a while, but still, why do us proud empires pass away? Take 20 minutes. I think we've gone 10 past and maybe a little after 10 past, so welcome back. We'll take a look at a couple of the other European empires. We're not looking at the Habsburg or the Austrian-Hungarian. We're not looking at the Dutch, Belgium, or Spain, but they were all there, and they were all at that conference in Berlin in 1884. But we want to take a look. We've already mentioned the role of the French, and then there is the German Empire also. So I suppose many of us watched, maybe you didn't enjoy it, but I think a lot of people did enjoy the television series Versailles. It featured the Sun King Louis XIV, who built the majestic palace at Versailles. And Louis had huge ambitions expressed in the architecture of that amazing palace itself. And of course, he wanted to acquire territory beyond. He was very much an imperialist, and he gave a lot of support to merchants and ship owners for colonial adventures. Now, French expansion then began to take place. They crossed the Atlantic. They pushed across the Atlantic. They colonized what was known as New France, but later was called Canada. Quebec was founded in 1608, Montreal in 1642. They pushed south to Louisiana, founding New Orleans in 1718. And from there, a large part of the Caribbean became French, including what later became Haiti. And the French created settlements in South America in a place like Guyana. And to the east, they pushed also. India was on their horizon, and the French East Indian Company was founded and formed in 1664. And by the end, towards the end of that 17th century, they had 2 bases in India, as well as islands in the Indian Ocean, including Mauritius. But then this French expansionism became a matter of serious concern for the Imperial British. Empires don't like each other. And not least India became a concern for the British and French involvement there. And so in 1755, the British declared war on France. It lasted 7 years. It forced the French to cut back on their imperial commitments. And during this time, the British conquered French Canada and islands in the Caribbean and French possessions in India. And so at the end of the 7 Years' War, France was left with very few colonies. But the loss did nothing to curb French imperial ambitions. The French then joined the American War of Independence against the British, and not only came out on the winning side, helping the Americans gain independence from British imperial power and throw the British out of America, France regained at this time Senegal and Tobago, and in 1780, that was 1782. And 6 years later, French colonial trade had actually overtaken that of Britain. However, as with other powers, the French colonies were thriving on the back of African slaves. Now, the American Declaration of Independence owes much to Scottish Enlightenment philosophy, which is very much the radical thought of an Irish Presbyterian like Francis Hutcheson. And you remember the words of Dependence or Constitution, we the people. Governments derive their power from the people. And when the French soldiers who had helped birth the new American Republic, when they returned to Paris, they were all too aware of the need for revolution. By 1789, the French Revolution was underway. And tragically, it produced the terror, with some 35,000 people dying by the guillotine. But a constitution was produced, prefaced by the rights of man and the citizen, giving expression to legal equality, legal protection of individual rights, the separation of church and state, and religious toleration. And all of this could not be contained in France. And France, in a sense, gave her new politics to Europe. And this era, I suppose, marks the beginning of a modern European politics. And yet France was to go on to lose ground. Napoleon declared himself an emperor, but by 1804 or 1802, he was in serious trouble, and the French colonialism was in decline. But it was not finished, because imperial reconstruction began, and the Treaty of Paris in 1814 restored all of the 1789 colonies. And then France looked to North Africa. The conquest of Algeria was completed between 1830 and 1848. Tahiti in Oceania was taken in 1842, and then Saigon in 1859. And all of this was the work of the Third Republic, formed after the defeat by the Prussians in the Prussian-French War of 1870-1871. And that republic brought about perhaps the greatest expansion of the French Empire. Between 1871 and 1914, France had an empire of 50 million people. Now, we've already mentioned this. After World War I, France received mandates with the British for the former Ottoman provinces and German colonies in Africa. Ignoring the League of Nations in relation to the mandates, France and Britain did their own imperial thing, with the French creating Syria and Lebanon as part of their empire. And from defeated Germany, the imperially controlled Paris Peace Conference gave France Togo and Cameroon. And with French control of territories in North Africa and Indochina, or Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, France was now the second largest empire in the world, the largest being the British Empire. France now had imperial presence in 5 continents. But by the 1950s, imperial wreckage littered Asia. The European empires that had dominated so much of Asia were in serious trouble, as Chinese peasant nationalism and China had unified under communist rule with Mao in 1950. Britain, France, Russia, the Netherlands, and Portugal were all in terminal decline. The Korean War began, which tragically partitioned Korea along the 38th parallel, a line agreed by the Americans and the Russians. And in 1954, the French had given up both Cambodia and Laos. In 1954, the French lost a decisive battle at Dien Bien Phu. French prestige was shattered, and it was impossible for the French to remain. As they were leaving, Southeast Asia, at a conference in Geneva, they agreed to partition Vietnam into North and South. And not for the first or last time has imperial presence, on leaving, partitioned countries with fateful legacies or leaving huge unresolved problems. France went home, but then the Americans foolishly got dragged into a bloody and humiliating war. In 7 years of fighting in Vietnam, the French lost 90,000 soldiers. Hundreds of thousands of civilians died, and Dien Bien Phu was a military disaster. But the end of the French Empire came when a catastrophic war was unleashed in Algeria in 1954. And in that war, the French lost 25,000 soldiers, 5,000 French civilians, and up to 300,000 Algerians also losing their lives. Algerian independence, familiar story. It was rushed with disastrous consequences. 1 million French Algerians were forced into exile, losing property and possessions. Tens of thousands of Algerians who had worked closely with the French were massacred. The Algerian War not only brought the French Empire to an end, but it also destroyed the Fourth Republic, almost brought France to civil war, and brought General de Gaulle to power. Conflict and revolt continued, but in March 1961, France held a referendum. 91% voted in favor of Algerian independence. The French Empire was no more, but the legacies of decolonization, including migration, race, and Islamist extremes, and right-wing nationalists, still haunt French politics and society with very recent and extreme violence. But then there was Germany. And we can't understand Germany without trying to understand in some way the role of Prussia. Prussia developed, came to dominate Germany, and Prussia dominated Germany at that creation of Germany in 1871, and was still the dominant power until 1918, when the German Empire came to an end. Prussia, for the record, was to survive until 1947, when it was removed from history and from the map of Europe, a state wiped out by the stroke of a pen. Perhaps Germans themselves wanted to forget that Prussia had ever existed. But there is no Germany without Prussia, and no German Empire without its dominant role. It was on the 18th of January 1871, around noon, that several hundred Prussian officers and members of the nobility, and those who had fought in the Franco-Prussian War, gathered in the Hall of Mirrors of the Palace of Versailles. And a great ceremony took place. And Wilhelm I, King of Prussia, became Kaiser Wilhelm, a Prussian king first and foremost, but emperor of the newly proclaimed German Empire. 29 German states became an empire on a day chosen by Bismarck, the architect of it all. That day itself was Prussia's National Day, and Bismarck held the ceremony at Versailles, not only humiliating the French, who had been beaten in that war, but because Bismarck could not and knew he could not proclaim the German Reich in any one of those German states. There was a fragility, but Bismarck had already declared that a war would unify the German people. And so the German Empire was born in a French palace. And soon there were those who wanted to expand its borders and become like already existing European imperial powers. Bismarck had always said that Germany would not pursue a policy of colonialism. But by 1884, he was under huge pressure. And on the 24th of April, he sent a telegram placing an African territory, which had been taken by a Bremen tobacco merchant, under the protection of the German Empire. And so what is now Namibia had become Germany's first colony. Germany was on its way to become a colonial power rather late in the day when compared to the French and the British empires. More colonies followed, and soon there was colonial territory 6 times larger than Germany itself. And Bismarck hosted, we've already mentioned, the African Conference in his own residence in Berlin in 1884, 1885, when Africa was color-coded into territories to be colonized in the scramble for Africa. And Leopold of Belgium had persuaded this conference to give him the Congo as his own imperial fiefdom. Germany was already active some months before the conference, acquiring protectorates in German Southwest Africa, Namibia, Togo, Cameroon. And in 1885, there was German East Africa, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi. And then followed German New Guinea in the South Pacific, German Samoa, and the smaller islands such as the Marshall Islands. And the Chinese province of Shandong was occupied, seen as a particularly prestigious opening up of German trade in East Asia. Now, empires do not like rival powers, and inevitably there was a rivalry that developed between Britain and Germany. There was an arms race developed, who could build the biggest warships, and so they set out on a warship building spree. But an imperial war was looming. And in 1914, 6 imperial powers began a catastrophic war that would bring 4 of those 6 empires crashing and leave the other 2 so gravely wounded that by the 1950s, they too would become historical wreckage. The Paris Peace Conference, at the end of all that, 11th November, for example, Prussian military leaders asked their government to sign an armistice. And so on the 11th of November 1918, it was signed, and with it the death warrant of the German Empire. The Paris Peace Conference opened in Versailles 48 years to the day of January 1871, when that German Empire had been proclaimed. It was no coincidence that it was on the same day in 1919. French leader Georges Clemenceau was bent on righting French wrongs, taking revenge and humiliating Germany. And so Germany lost Alsace and Lorraine and a lot of other territory, some 27,000 square miles, and lost 6.5 million people. The Treaty of Versailles stripped Germany of its colonies. The empire, well, it had been short-lived. In 1871, it had begun at Versailles, and 48 years later, to the day, at Versailles, it ended. Well, that's a sample of some of those European empires that dominated the world from the 15th century through to the 20th. We'll not go into groups. We can have an open conversation now, your reflections, your responses to some of that. We might want to ask, well, why did Europe rule the world from the 15th to the 20th century? And what are the legacies of all that?